The Minnesota wilderness was a sight to behold. Pristine lakes, towering pines, and a sky that seemed to stretch into eternity. My friends and I, four intrepid souls, had planned this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be an adventure, a break from our mundane lives. But none of us could have anticipated the terror that awaited us. We arrived at the campsite around noon. The sun was high, casting dappled shadows through the forest canopy. We set up our tents by a serene lake, its surface like a mirror reflecting the surrounding trees. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves. As night fell, we gathered around a crackling fire, sharing stories and laughter. The darkness was thick, an impenetrable blanket that enveloped the forest. Suddenly, the jovial atmosphere was shattered by a bone-chilling howl. It echoed through the trees, a sound so alien and unnatural that it froze our blood. What the hell was that? Mark, the most seasoned camper among us, asked, his face pale in the firelight. Probably just a wolf, I replied, trying to sound confident. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with that sound, something that spoke to a primal fear buried deep within. We decided to turn in early, hoping the warmth of our sleeping bags would chase away the unease. I lay in my tent, listening to the night. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. My mind conjured images of eyes watching us from the darkness. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a scream. It was Sarah, her voice shrill and filled with terror. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart pounding. The campfire had long since died, and the only light was the weak beam from my flashlight. "Sarah!" I called, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" I found her standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes wide with fear. She was staring into the darkness, her body rigid. "Sarah, what's wrong?" I asked, shaking her gently. She turned to me, her face ashen. "I saw it," she whispered. "It was standing right there, at the edge of the trees." "What did you see?" I pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. It looked like a man, but twisted. Its eyes were glowing, and it had this horrible smell, like death. A shiver ran down my spine. "We need to wake the others." We roused Mark and Jenna, explaining what had happened. Mark, always the skeptic, suggested it was just a bad dream or a trick of the light. But Sarah was insistent, and her fear was contagious. We decided to stay up for the rest of the night, keeping the fire going and taking turns keeping watch. The hours dragged on, and every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. Dawn finally broke, and with the first light of day, our fear seemed almost foolish. We decided to stay one more night, partly out of stubbornness and partly because we didn't want to believe our trip was ruined. The day passed uneventfully, but as the sun began to set, a sense of dread settled over us. We fortified our camp, gathering more firewood than we thought we'd need and setting up a perimeter of makeshift torches. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in around us. The fire cast flickering shadows that danced at the edge of our vision. We sat in tense silence, listening, waiting. Then, just as before, the howl pierced the night. It was closer this time, and it was followed by the sound of something moving through the trees, something big. We huddled closer to the fire, our eyes scanning the darkness. And then we saw it. At the edge of the firelight, a figure emerged. It was tall, emaciated, with skin stretched tight over bones. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its mouth was twisted into a ghastly grin. "It's a Wendigo," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here." The creature stepped closer, and the stench of decay filled the air. It moved with a grotesque, jerky motion, like a marionette with tangled strings. We grabbed what we could and ran. The forest was a blur of trees and shadows. Behind us, the Wendigo howled, a sound that seemed to vibrate in our bones. We stumbled through the underbrush, our lungs burning, hearts pounding. The creature was relentless, always just behind us. Its guttural growls and the snapping of branches drove us onward. We reached a clearing, and in the faint light of dawn, we saw an old, abandoned cabin. We raced inside, slamming the door behind us. The cabin was dark and musty, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the terror outside. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find: old furniture, broken boards. The Wendigo's howls grew louder, and we could hear it circling the cabin, scratching at the walls. "We can't stay here," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "It will find a way in." "There's a trap door," Mark said, pointing to the floor. "It might lead to a cellar or a crawl space." We pried it open and descended into the darkness, pulling the door shut above us. The cellar was damp and cold, filled with the remnants of old supplies and tools. We huddled together, listening to the creature above us. It clawed at the trap door, its growls vibrating through the wood. Time lost all meaning as we waited in the darkness, hoping it would tire and leave. Hours passed, and the sounds eventually faded. We waited until we were sure it was gone before cautiously emerging. The cabin was in ruins, the door and windows shattered. The Wendigo had torn through it in a frenzy, but it seemed to have moved on. We didn't waste any time. We gathered our remaining supplies and made our way back to the campsite. The journey back to civilization was a blur of exhaustion and fear, but we didn't stop until we reached the safety of our cars. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest. It seemed peaceful in the morning light, but I knew what lurked within. We had survived our encounter with the Wendigo, but the memory of those glowing eyes and that twisted grin would haunt us forever. The Minnesota wilderness had shown us its dark heart, and it was a place we would never forget. The Wendigo's call had changed us, leaving a mark on our souls that no amount of time could erase.